Viking religious practices formed the foundation of Norse cultural identity and provided frameworks for understanding the natural world, human existence, and the relationship between mortals and divine forces. Norse religion was polytheistic and featured a complex pantheon of gods and goddesses who governed different aspects of life and required proper veneration through rituals, sacrifices, and observances. Viking cosmology described the universe as consisting of 9 worlds connected by the world tree Yggdrasil, with each realm inhabited by different beings including gods, giants, elves, dwarves, and humans. This cosmological structure influenced Norse understanding of existence and guided religious practices throughout Viking territories. Ancient Viking primary deities included Odin the Allfather, who ruled Asgard and possessed wisdom and magic, Thor the thunder god, who protected humanity with his mighty hammer, and Freyr and Freya, who governed fertility and prosperity. Each deity had specific domains and received worship appropriate to their powers and responsibilities. Viking temple construction created sacred spaces where communities gathered for religious ceremonies and maintained connections with divine forces. Temples were typically wooden structures with carved posts, decorated interiors, and designated areas for offerings and ritual activities. Ancient Viking sacred groves provided natural settings for religious observances in outdoor locations where ancient trees, springs, or rock formations held spiritual significance. Grove ceremonies connected worshippers directly with natural forces and ancestral spirits that inhabited these sacred spaces. Viking sacrifice rituals offered animals, food, precious objects, and occasionally humans to gods in exchange for divine favor, protection, and prosperity. Sacrifices were performed according to specific protocols and timing that maximized their effectiveness and honored proper relationships between mortals and deities. Ancient Viking animal sacrifice typically involved horses, cattle, pigs, or other livestock that were ritually killed and their blood collected for sprinkling on altars, worshippers, and sacred objects. Sacrificed animals were then butchered and consumed in communal feasts that shared divine blessings among participants. Viking blot ceremonies represented the most important religious observances and occurred at specific times throughout the year to mark seasonal changes and honor particular deities. Blot ceremonies combined sacrifice, feasting, and ritual drinking in elaborate events that strengthened community bonds while maintaining proper divine relationships. Ancient Viking seasonal festivals celebrated key agricultural and astronomical events, including winter solstice, spring planting, midsummer, and autumn harvest. These festivals aligned human activities with natural cycles and ensured continued divine support for community prosperity. Viking priesthood functions were typically performed by community leaders, including chieftains and wealthy landowners who possessed the status and resources necessary to conduct proper ceremonies. Priestly duties involved maintaining sacred spaces, performing sacrifices, and interpreting divine signs and omens. Ancient Viking cider magic represented a specialized form of Norse spirituality that involved trance states, prophecy, and manipulation of fate through ritual practices. Cider practitioners, often women called Valdas, possessed knowledge of herb lore, chanting, and ceremonial techniques that enabled communication with spirits and divine forces. Viking rune casting used carved symbols to divine future events, seek guidance from gods, and perform magical operations. Runes possessed both practical functions as written characters and mystical significance as channels for supernatural power. Ancient Viking amulet wearing provided personal protection and divine favor through small objects inscribed with runes shaped like sacred symbols or containing materials with magical properties. Common amulets included Thor's hammers, which offered protection and strength to wearers. Viking oath-taking invoked divine witnesses to sworn promises and created sacred obligations that carried severe supernatural consequences for violations. Oaths were taken on sacred rings, weapons, or other objects that connected human promises with divine authority. Ancient Viking funeral practices reflected beliefs about afterlife destinations and proper treatment of the dead to ensure their successful transition to other realms. Funeral customs varied according to social status, regional traditions, and specific circumstances of death. Viking burial methods included both inhumation and cremation, depending on local customs and available resources. Bodies or cremated remains were placed in graves with personal possessions, tools, and sometimes vehicles that would serve the deceased in the afterlife. Ancient Viking grave goods demonstrated social status and provided deceased individuals with items they would need in the afterlife, including clothing, jewelry, tools, food, and drink. Wealthy burials contained elaborate goods including ships, horses, and enslaved individuals sacrificed to serve their masters. Viking ship burials represented the most elaborate funeral practices and involved placing deceased individuals in vessels that were either buried under mounds or burned in spectacular cremation ceremonies. Ship burials symbolized the journey to the afterlife and displayed enormous wealth and status. Ancient Viking memorial stones marked burial sites and commemorated deceased individuals through carved inscriptions and artistic designs. Runestones provided lasting records of names, deeds, and relationships that preserved memories across generations. Viking ancestor veneration maintained connections with deceased family members who could provide guidance, protection, and blessings from their positions in the afterlife. Ancestors received offerings and prayers that acknowledged their continued importance to living descendants. Ancient Viking afterlife beliefs described multiple possible destinations for the dead, including Valhalla for warriors who died in combat, Folkvanger for those chosen by Freya, and Hell for those who died of natural causes. Each destination had different characteristics and requirements for admission. Viking prophecy interpretation sought to understand divine will and future events through signs, omens, dreams, and prophetic utterances. Skilled interpreters could discern meaning in natural phenomena, can provide guidance for important decisions. Ancient Viking curse practices invoked supernatural forces to harm enemies through ritual formulas, carved runes, and ceremonial actions. Curses were taken seriously and could have devastating psychological effects, even if supernatural mechanisms remained uncertain. Viking protective magic employed various techniques, including ritual objects, spoken formulas, and symbolic actions to defend against supernatural threats and human enemies. Protective practices reflected deep beliefs in unseen forces that could be manipulated through proper Knowledge. Ancient Viking healing rituals combined practical medical treatments with religious ceremonies that invoked divine assistance for recovery from illness and injury. Healing practices acknowledged both physical and spiritual dimensions of health and disease. Viking weather magic attempted to influence atmospheric conditions through sacrifices, incantations, and ritual actions that appealed to gods and spirits who controlled winds, rain, and temperature. Weather manipulation was particularly important for seafaring communities, dependent on favorable sailing conditions. Ancient Viking agricultural rituals ensured successful crops through ceremonies that honored fertility deities, maintained proper relationships with land spirits. Planting and harvest times were marked with special observances that connected human labor with divine blessings. Viking Christianity conversion gradually transformed Norse religious practices beginning in the late Viking age as Christian missionaries and political pressures encouraged abandonment of traditional beliefs. Conversion was often incomplete, with Christian and pagan practices blending in syncretic forms that persisted for generations. Viking trade networks extended throughout the known world and connected Scandinavia with distant regions including the Byzantine Empire, the Middle East, Central Asia, and North America. Norse merchants traveled vast distances by sea and land to exchange goods that could not be produced locally, while establishing commercial relationships that brought wealth and exotic materials to Viking territories. Viking trade routes followed established paths that connected major commercial centers through combinations of maritime and overland transportation. The most important routes included the Baltic Sea network, North Sea connections to Western Europe, river systems penetrating into Russia, and the famous Volga route to the Caspian Sea and beyond. Ancient Viking merchant vessels differed from military longships through increased cargo capacity, higher freeboard, and more robust construction that prioritized carrying capacity over speed and maneuverability. Trading ships called nares could transport substantial loads across open ocean while maintaining seaworthiness in challenging conditions. Viking navigation for trade voyages required extensive knowledge of currents, winds, coastal features, and celestial navigation that enabled merchants to reach distant destinations and return safely with valuable cargoes. Trading voyages could take months or years to complete and exposed participants to numerous hazards. Ancient Viking trade goods exported from Scandinavia included furs, walrus ivory, amber, timber, iron, soapstone vessels, and enslaved people captured during raids or purchased from other sources. These products commanded high prices in foreign markets and provided wealth that supported Viking society. Viking imports brought luxury goods, raw materials, and specialized products from distant regions including silk, spices, wine, glass, silver, weapons, and fine textiles that were unavailable in Scandinavia. Imported goods demonstrated wealth and status while providing materials for local crafts. Ancient Viking precious metal trade involved large quantities of silver obtained through commerce and tribute payments that flowed into Scandinavia from throughout the Viking world. Silver served as currency, raw material for jewelry, and portable wealth that could be divided or combined as needed. Viking market towns developed at strategic locations where merchants gathered to exchange goods, negotiate deals, and access services including lodging, storage, and financial arrangements. Major trading centers like Burka, Hidibi, and Kaupang attracted merchants from throughout the known world. Ancient Viking trading season followed. Favorable weather patterns and typically occurred during summer months when ice-free seas and passable overland routes enabled safe travel. Winter months saw reduced trading activity with merchants returning home or wintering in foreign ports. Viking merchant organization included individual traders, family trading ventures, and larger commercial partnerships that pooled resources and shared risks across multiple voyages. Successful merchants accumulated substantial wealth and gained social status through their commercial activities. Ancient Viking currency systems used silver by weight rather than coined money for most transactions, with merchants carrying scales and weights to verify the value of silver pieces exchanged for goods. This flexible system allowed transactions of any value through division or combination of silver. Viking credit arrangements enabled merchants to obtain goods on delayed payment terms, extending commercial networks beyond immediate cash transactions. Credit relationships required trust and reputation that merchants carefully cultivated through honest dealings and reliable payment. Ancient Viking commercial law governed trading activities through customary rules that defined proper behavior, resolved disputes, and punished fraud or theft. Legal frameworks supported commerce by creating predictable conditions where merchants could operate with reasonable confidence. Viking market security protected merchants, goods, and transactions from theft and violence through arrangements between market operators and local authorities. Market peace regulations prohibited violence during trading periods and provided mechanisms for resolving disputes without disruption. Ancient Viking shipping insurance did not exist in formal terms, but merchants managed risks through diversification of cargoes, shared ownership of vessels and goods, and maintenance of reserves to absorb losses. Risk management was essential for long-term commercial success. Viking trading partnerships formed between merchants from different regions who provided local knowledge, warehouse facilities, and commercial connections that enabled foreign traders to operate effectively in unfamiliar markets. Partnership networks created extensive commercial systems. Ancient Viking brokerage services connected buyers and sellers, while facilitating transactions through knowledge of market conditions, available goods, and potential trading partners. Brokers earned commissions or fees for their services and provided valuable market intelligence. Viking warehouse storage protected valuable goods in secure facilities during the periods between purchase and resale or while awaiting favorable shipping conditions. Proper storage prevented damage and theft while maintaining product quality. Ancient Viking slave trade represented a significant but morally troubling aspect of Viking commerce that involved capturing, purchasing, and selling human beings as property throughout Viking trading networks. Enslaved people were traded to various destinations and served as laborers, concubines, and household servants. Viking fur trade obtained pelts from northern forests through combinations of hunting, trapping, and trading with indigenous peoples who supplied valuable furs, including beaver, marten, fox, and squirrel. Fur processing and grading determined value in distant markets. Ancient Viking amber collection gathered fossilized tree resin from Baltic shores where this precious material washed up naturally and could be collected. without mining or complex extraction. Amber was highly valued for jewelry and decorative arts. Throughout the ancient world. Viking walrus hunting expeditions traveled to far northern waters, where these marine mammals provided ivory, tusks that substituted for elephant ivory in European markets. Walrus ivory carving created elaborate decorative objects and practical items valued by wealthy patrons. Ancient Viking timber trade exported high-quality wood from Scandinavian forests to regions where suitable timber was scarce or unavailable. Shipbuilding timber was particularly valuable and commanded premium prices in markets throughout Europe. Viking iron production created trade goods from bog iron deposits that were smelted and forged into bars or finished products for export. Scandinavian iron quality varied, but the best products found ready markets in regions lacking good local sources. Ancient Viking textile trade involved both export of Scandinavian woolens and import of fine fabrics, including silk and linen from distant production centers. Textile quality ranged from coarse, everyday materials to luxury fabrics reserved for wealthy consumers. Viking spice imports brought exotic flavorings from the Middle East and Asia, including pepper, cinnamon, and other aromatics that were highly valued in Norse cuisine despite their enormous cost. Spice trade was extremely profitable, but required extensive commercial networks. Ancient Viking wine trade imported grape wine from continental Europe to supplement local mead and ale production. Wine was expensive and primarily consumed by wealthy individuals who could afford imported luxuries. Viking glass imports brought vessels, beads, and raw glass from production centers in the Rhineland and Middle East. Glassworking in Scandinavia transformed imported raw materials into finished products that combined foreign materials with Norse craftsmanship. Ancient Viking weapon trade supplied high-quality swords, spears, and other arms through both import and local production using imported materials. Frankish swords were particularly prized and commanded high prices in Scandinavian markets. Viking women's roles in Norse society encompassed far more responsibilities and autonomy than women in many contemporary cultures. With legal rights, economic power, and social influence that enabled them to manage households, businesses, and property during men's absences. Viking Age women operated within patriarchal structures but possessed significant agency in shaping their lives and communities. Viking household management placed women in charge of domestic operations, including food preparation, textile production, child rearing, and supervision of servants and enslaved people. These responsibilities required organizational skills, technical knowledge, and leadership abilities that made women essential to family survival and prosperity. Ancient Viking textile production represented the most important female craft activity and involved every stage of cloth making from fiber preparation through spinning, weaving, and garment construction. Women's textile work clothed families, produced trade goods, and created wealth that contributed substantially to household economies. Viking spinning transformed processed wool, linen, or other fibers into thread using simple spindles that could be operated while performing other tasks. Skilled spinners produced thread of consistent quality and thickness suitable for specific weaving purposes. Ancient Viking weaving utilized vertical warp-weighted looms that created fabric from spun thread through interlacing perpendicular yarn systems. Looms occupied substantial space in Viking homes and produced cloth of various widths and patterns depending on intended uses. Viking dyeing processes colored textiles using plant-based dyes, including madder for red, woad for blue, and various local plants for yellow, brown, and green shades. Dye preparation and application required knowledge of mordants and techniques that achieved consistent, color-fast results. Ancient Viking garment construction involved cutting fabric, sewing seams, and adding decorative elements that created functional clothing appropriate to weather conditions and social occasions. Women's sewing skills produced everything from everyday work clothes to elaborate ceremonial garments. Viking embroidery enhanced clothing and household textiles through decorative stitching that displayed artistic skill and added value to basic fabrics. Complex embroidery indicated wealth and status while demonstrating the needleworker's abilities. Ancient Viking dairy management involved women in milking livestock, processing milk into various products, and storing dairy goods for family consumption and potential trade. Dairy products provided essential nutrition and represented valuable household production. Viking food preservation fell primarily to women, who prepared supplies that sustained families through winter months when fresh food was unavailable. Preservation techniques included drying, smoking, salting, and fermentation that required skill and careful attention. Ancient Viking brewing and beverage production created ale, mead, and other fermented drinks that were consumed daily and served at feasts. Women's brewing knowledge determined beverage quality and household beverage supplies. Viking child-rearing responsibilities included feeding, clothing, educating, and socializing children according to gender-specific expectations and family circumstances. Mothers trained daughters in domestic skills, while fathers taught sons outdoor and martial abilities. Ancient Viking marriage arrangements involved women's families in negotiations about bride prices, dowries, and property rights that accompanied unions between families. Women had some voice in marriage decisions, though family interests typically dominated individual preferences. Viking property rights allowed women to own land, livestock, and movable goods independently of their husbands, providing economic security and leverage within marriages. Women could inherit property from parents and maintain control over their own wealth. Ancient Viking divorce options enabled women to end unsuccessful marriages under certain circumstances and recover their dowries and personal property. Divorce was relatively accessible compared to contemporary European societies that prohibited marital dissolution. Viking widowhood gave women increased independence and control over family resources as they managed estates and raised children without male oversight. Wealthy widows could wield substantial economic and social power in their communities. Ancient Viking business management involved women in running farms, trading operations, and craft workshops either independently or during husbands' absences. Women's business activities contributed significantly to family wealth and community economies. Viking legal standing granted women capacity to testify in legal proceedings, bring lawsuits, and defend their interests in court, though male relatives often represented them. Women's legal rights exceeded those in many contemporary societies. Ancient Viking religious roles included women as priestesses, prophetesses, and practitioners of cider magic who maintained spiritual connections and performed ceremonies. Some women gained considerable influence through religious authority. Viking medical knowledge positioned women as primary healthcare providers who treated illnesses, delivered babies, and cared for injured and sick family members. Women's medical skills combined practical experience with folk remedies and spiritual practices. Ancient Viking elderly care typically fell to women who looked after aging parents and relatives unable to care for themselves. Providing proper care for elderly family members fulfilled important social and religious obligations. Viking slave supervision assigned women responsibility for managing enslaved workers who performed household tasks, agricultural labor, and craft production. Mistresses' treatment of enslaved people varied from harsh exploitation to relatively humane management. Ancient Viking social networking created and maintained relationships with other women through visiting, gift exchanges, and mutual assistance that provided emotional support and practical help during challenges. Women's networks functioned as informal social safety systems. Viking entertainment participation included women in feasts, games, and social gatherings where they conversed, displayed their finery, and contributed to community celebrations. Some women gained reputations as skilled storytellers or musicians. Ancient Viking political influence operated indirectly as women advised husbands and sons, arranged marriages, and used their economic resources to support political objectives. Powerful women could shape political outcomes through strategic use of their positions. Viking education responsibilities placed women in charge of teaching daughters domestic skills, social graces, and cultural knowledge necessary for adult roles. Mothers transmitted women's knowledge across generations through direct instruction and example. Ancient Viking foster relationships involved women hosting children from other families to forge alliances, provide education, and strengthen social networks. Foster mothers developed strong bonds with foster children that created lasting connections between families. Viking conflict resolution engaged women in mediating disputes, counseling restraint, and using social pressure to prevent or end conflicts. Women's peacemaking efforts complemented male honor culture with pragmatic concerns about conflict costs. Ancient Viking mourning customs assigned women prominent roles in funeral preparations, ritual lamentations, and commemorative activities that honored the dead and comforted survivors. Women's emotional expressions provided socially acceptable outlets for grief. Viking storytelling preservation passed oral traditions to new generations through women's narratives about family histories, legends, and cultural values. Women's storytelling maintained cultural continuity and educated children in Norse heritage. Ancient Viking seasonal work patterns concentrated women's labor during harvest, preservation, and textile production periods when urgent tasks required extended hours in coordinated family efforts. Seasonal rhythms structured women's work throughout the year,